Hello, welcome everyone to this panel on history and other lessons for retreat. I'm Liz Kozlov. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and sharing today's session, in part because we have an incredible set of panelists who are going to be sharing their work, and also because of the session's focus on history, understood very broadly. When we talk about retreat and think about retreat, it's often with a focus on the future, thinking about who will have to move, where, when, under the new climate conditions that we face. But, my view, and from what I've learned in my own research, how retreat plays out depends in huge part on the past, on people's past experiences, on how particular people came to be living in particular places, on how these places came to be at risk, and what it means to lose or transform them. And so despite living in what can feel like unprecedented times, facing unprecedented sets of challenges, not least to do with how do we retreat and how do we retreat in more just ways, the past has many lessons to teach us. And so some of these we'll be hearing about today, and all of our speakers touch in different ways on the idea of history and past experience and understanding retreat. Before we turn to our first speaker, I'll just note that unfortunately Amanda Martin can no longer join us today, but she does have a paper out in a new special issue of the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences that's on managed retreat and environmental justice, the whole issue. And there's many participants in the conference who have papers in that volume, so I'd encourage you to check it out. Each of our speakers will talk for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for Q&A. So please feel free to drop questions in as we go along, and I'll moderate some of those at the end. So our first speaker will be Kirsten Howard, a doctoral student at the University of New Hampshire, and also the Resilience Program Coordinator for the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Coastal Program. And I'll do short bios for each speaker in turn, but I'd encourage you to take a look at their full bios on the session page too, because they all have just an immense amount of relevant experience and have worked in this topic for quite a long time. So with that, Kirsten, please take it away.
Thanks, Liz. All right. So the story I am going to tell you about takes place on Ndakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. Some of these peoples currently lack federal recognition, and there are no federally recognized tribes in New Hampshire. And the land in this story takes place on land that continues to be unceded. I acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the Alnobak, the people who have stewarded Ndakina throughout the generations. The place is Hampton Beach, New Hampshire. In the late 1800s, Hampton Beach was turning into an incredibly popular beach vacation destination. And the trolley lines connecting the region to the beach were at the heart of the reason for this transformation. They led to a boom in development: casino, hotels, cottages, bandstand. In 1922, a promotional pamphlet claimed Hampton Beach was the Atlantic City of New England, touting, among other things, its plentiful free parking. So it's the 1890s, and the Hampton River mouth is shifting, and sand is beginning to fill in the channel. One night during a storm, the whole area fills in with sand, causing White Rocks Island to attach to the main barrier dune system of Hampton Beach. Taking advantage of a complete lack of zoning, a man named Frank Beckman set up his fishing and hunting camp on this new land, claiming it as a squatter. Now, New Hampshire isn't known as a coastal state, but still to this day, Hampton Beach is known as a beach town. Today, the town actually has has around 15,000 residents, but sees an influx of up to 100,000 people on a busy, hot summer day. It's still an accessible day trip for many folks living in Boston, Manchester, Nashua, surrounding cities. It's also relatively inclusive, possibly one of the most culturally, racially, and economically diverse recreational destinations in northern New England. And unsurprisingly, Hampton Beach is also an economic gem for the state. So the Hampton Beach State Park reels in over $2 million in parking fees on an annual basis, and the surplus generated by this state park is used to cover the operational expenses at its other parks around the state. But Hampton Beach, like many of our beloved beach towns, is facing down the specter of sea level rise. Some of the lowest lying neighborhoods abutting the Back Bay salt marsh saw more than 140 high tide floods creep up their streets and into their yards last year. 2 feet of sea level rise at Hampton Beach will render the most low-lying neighborhoods extremely hard to access on a daily basis, and 4 feet of sea level rise covers most of the residential portions of the beach. And yet zoning variances abound, new condos pop up left and right, and home values keep rising. And for some, it's just as hard to see that pattern slowing down as it is to envision stopping the rising tides. So we're back in the 1890s, and following Beckman's lead, other people started putting up shacks and cottages, and the White Rocks Island area quickly turned into Hampton Beach's biggest cottage development in just a few years. Then at a 1903 town meeting, voters agreed that the land had been taken illegally from the town, and they directed the select board to remove 10 squatter cottages, including Frank Beckman's. There are some dramatic but unconfirmed accounts of what happened next. Selectmen stormed the site. Beckman had them arrested and held on $5,000 bail, but not before they destroyed his cottage. And then in a better documented legal battle that ensued, the courts ruled that the town, which had been the town owned most of the White Rocks Island land, but not Beckman's cottage, which he had been occupying continuously since the late 1800s, and therefore he owned the title. So Beckman rebuilt his home, and it stood for another 50 years out on the White Rocks. Instead of removing the other cottages, the town began charging lot rent to the people who built there, collecting $8 per lot from 27 people in 1908. And then 2 years later, the number of renters had increased to 70. The town built up the streets, added sewers, added water mains. And then at around the same time, the town was demolishing the protective dunes that were further north to build parking lots, roads, and other building lots. But then came the storms. So between 1911 and 1928, erosion from storms took 50 acres of what they called buildable land at White Rocks Island, including 200 housing lots, 127 cottages, streets, sewers, water mains, and $50,000 worth of breakwaters. In 1919, a storm took 18 houses from Bridge and Franklin Avenues. The highest tide in 14 years hit the beach in April of 1929, and water was waist deep on Exeter Street. A January 1931 storm caused 40 White Island houses to be flooded over their first floors. Soon after, almost all that remained of the original development at White Rocks Island was Beckman's house. But throughout this whole period, cottage owners were securing lots elsewhere and moving their cottages using oxen and horses. Because they owned the cottage but didn't own the White Rocks Island land, they could more easily move. After one storm, Precinct Commissioner Fred Gagney said he corralled some floating houses, claimed them for himself, and then set them up on Epping Avenue, where they still stood in the 1980s. March 1931 storm that destroyed 15 cottages would have destroyed more, but they had previously been moved to other streets. So the weak wooden breakwaters that were built by the town in 1914 clearly weren't helping. And in the 1930s, the beach precinct, the town, and the state all commissioned studies to figure out what to do to protect the beach. One report suggested that White's Island, the whole area, would make an excellent state park. An engineer recommended building massive jetties to stabilize the river channel, breakwaters for storm protection, and fill to reclaim the lost land behind the structures. Breakwater cost was estimated at $610,000, which is about $12 million today. And the problem was that the town didn't have that kind of money. So the state offered to take the land and take over the land and then pay for the protection. Wary of ceding control of the land, the town voted down the state's proposal several times, and then fights ensued in the papers, heated discussion about folks uptown not having the interests of the beach at heart. A state legislature wrote a bill to take the beach by eminent domain and turn it into a park. And then another major storm hit in 1933, and voters quickly approved the land transfer to the state by a 5-to-1 margin. 18,600 tons of stone were mobilized. Sand was dredged from the channel, creating 50 acres of land that was turned into Hampton Beach State Park. Their parking lot, their bathhouse, and their RV park sit right where White Rocks Island used to be. And the Hampton Beach State Park opened in 1937. Millions of dollars continue to be spent by state and federal government to dredge the channel, nourish the beaches, and repair storm damage today, but they also let the dunes grow back. So over the past couple of years, the New Hampshire Coastal Resilience Program, where I work, helped the Hampton Department of Public Works complete a hydrodynamic flood study and recommendations for 2 neighborhoods shown here. The reports were published in March of 2021, and they contained the first formal recommendation to consider managed retreat via voluntary buyouts as part of a suite of strategies spaced out over time. The town also completed a master plan vision update in 2021, and the vision identifies a need to curb development at the beach and prioritize development in safe areas, and highlights the need to use buyouts for managed retreat. This is a town that is responsible for 20% of all of New Hampshire's flood insurance claims, but it doesn't have a full-time floodplain manager and has never submitted a competitive FEMA grant application. Needless to say, the prospects of soliciting properties, applying for grants, and then managing buyouts are pretty daunting. In October, we'll begin a project specifically aimed at building Hampton's and our capacity to access FEMA hazard mitigation funds and create a preliminary plan for how the town could offer buyouts to its residents who express interest. When I reflect on the White Rocks Island story and why it might matter in the context of the challenges we face in Hampton today, first, I think about the lessons that we continue not to learn about the power of the sea and the sand, and perhaps in part because we continue to ignore the wisdom collected over what had to be many full moon high tides by the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. They went to the water to fish, but they settled further off of the shore. At the same time, I think about the determination driven by a love of place in this community and the slow, painful process of relearning hard lessons. Like many stories that are about moving away from the water, this story is nuanced. It's complicated. I think about how the outcomes of White Rocks Island were influenced by a lack of resources at the local level, and that because of that, the town gave up the land to the state and the power dynamics shifted forever, while at the same time, public access was perpetually guaranteed. I think about land ownership and privilege. People self-finance the movement of their cottages from White Rocks Island, or they cut their losses. The cottages were mostly second homes. Today's vulnerable neighborhoods in Hampton are occupied by a mix of full-time and part-time residents, and some say that more full-time residents are moving to the beach. But second home ownership brings up a really important question of how the residents and owners should be supported if they need to move, and who should support them. It is important to zoom in real close though. So some of the part-time residents residences, cottages, are rented as low-cost winter rentals to low-income transient folks who bear the brunt of the storm season in the wintertime. And I also think about the tipping points. It took many years of damaging storms to mobilize government responses. I see that same pattern playing out now, the same hesitancy to lead proactively when it's politically challenging. Finally, I think about how White Rocks Island's development and disappearance really wasn't that long ago. Lawsuits challenging the original land transfer to the state have been popping up in the courts ever since the 1930s. The history of a place, whether you know the history or not, is built into the culture and attitudes of its people. The rugged individualism that is often touted with pride by Hampton residents might be rooted, at least in part, in the history of weathering damaging storms and moving homes with oxen. Hampton's White Rocks Island story is an interesting one, but it's not unique. And I posit that a history of relocation and resistance has colored this place in the way that it colors many places, and that understanding that history is helpful in all cases to improve the way that we approach relocation processes that are going to play out in so many communities over the next decades. So I'm looking forward to unpacking more, and I hope this story has brought up as many questions for you as it has for me.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Those photos are absolutely incredible. What a story, and so many lessons to learn from it. So thank you for that. Next, we have Erica Avrami, who is the James Marston Fitch Assistant Professor of Historic Preservation at Columbia University.
Thanks so much, Liz. Let me share my screen. Is that visible?
Yes, perfect.
Terrific. Okay. So thank you everyone who's joining us this evening and from different times of days in the different parts of the world. This talk is entitled Co-Learning in Place, Social-Spatial Histories as a Tool for Equitable Resilience. And the talk is premised on a few assumptions that I want to kind of put out there from the get-go. First, that decision-making about equitable resilience, adaptation, and climate-related migration should be community-engaged processes that recognize different knowledges and ways of knowing. That such processes of community engagement cannot focus solely on planning for the future. The past is also important. Structural legacies of racism and social injustice are embedded in spatial conditions and in built forms, and such exclusion can be perpetuated and amplified as communities confront the challenges of climate resilience, especially the specter of managed retreat. So without a deep understanding and recognition of these pre-existing conditions and place-specific histories, design and planning for climate adaptation and mitigation run the risk of reinforcing the continued spatial marginalization of vulnerable or excluded publics, especially people of color, the foreign-born, and the economically disadvantaged. The third assumption that this is premised on is that professionals dedicated to the design and management of the built environment, such as planners, architects, engineers, and preservationists, play a frontline role in these decisions, but they are ill prepared to address the community dynamics, social dimensions, and place attachments associated with climate adaptation and migration, let alone the structural legacies of exclusion that are codified in the built environment. And developing capacities at institutions of learning and within the profession they educate constitutes a critical priority, and one that can only be endeavored by working with communities in place to co-learn and co-create knowledge. So I want to kind of put that out there as the assumptions I'm working from. And based on these assumptions, in early 2020, we developed a studio course in the graduate program of historic preservation in Columbia School of Architecture that sought to prepare emerging professionals to confront the challenges of equitable resilience through this kind of community engaged research, to really build their skill set and help them learn to apply some of the skills and tools that already exist within the profession, but to also expand that methodological range. The studio was premised on concepts of community engaged learning and research and applied tools specifically of preservation. I teach in a preservation program in order to understand and promote equitable resilience in the flood-prone waterfront community of Red Hook, Brooklyn. Students looked at histories, narratives, multiple publics, and how they were represented in the built environment of Red Hook, historically and today. And they looked at physical, social, and environmental change longitudinally with this eye toward exclusion and injustice. And fundamentally found that there are community and spatial conditions in the neighborhood that still reflect a starkly divided community along both racial and economic lines. I want to make a couple of acknowledgements too. I want to acknowledge my own identity and positionality. I'm a white woman on faculty at a predominantly white institution, and that privilege gives me pause, particularly when working on questions of equity and in communities of color. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that the work I'm presenting is the experimental and collaborative work of students, co-faculty, and incredibly generous Red Hook community members, including Karen Blondell and Thad Pawlowski, who spoke in an earlier session of this conference. Red Hook is a mixed-use neighborhood with a prevalent history of waterfront industry. It's bounded by the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. To the east, it's got these features of Atlantic Basin and Erie Basin, which are critical waterfront industrial locations for the city of New York. It's also home to one of the earliest public housing projects in New York City, the Red Hook houses, which contain 70% of the neighborhood's population. The development of Red Hook shoreline is one of artificial expansion, mirroring the growth of the maritime industry in Red Hook. And as the industry matured during the 19th century, the shoreline and land were further developed to meet its growing needs. And as a result, today, Red Hook is very susceptible to flooding, exacerbated by this infilled land that you can see students try to visualize in this graphic. It's also prevalent in this aftermath or this outcome of Hurricane Sandy, where you can see just how devastated the neighborhood was after Hurricane Sandy. Oops. Sorry about that. And these environmental, vulnerabilities sort of, are complicated as well by issues of sewage. In 1886, there was very minimal sewage in the Red Hook community. You can see the sewerless streets on the left, and on the right, you can see contemporary imagery of sewage flooding happening. And so all of these environmental vulnerabilities, create risk for the community of Red Hook, but also represent these sort of recurrent patterns and legacies of vulnerability that are heavily connected to questions of justice and equity. Indeed, these environmentally vulnerable geographies became home to generations of publics, many of whom were marginalized due to race, poverty, and ethnicity. Housing was a critical aspect, as I mentioned earlier, of Red Hook. There was a history of informal settlements, shanty towns, and then Hoovervilles that were prevalent in Red Hook. And on the right, you can see the area of infilled land, or an area of infilled land that housed many of these informal housing settlements. And you can also see how there's a co-location, a sort of overlaying geography of how these historic areas of informal settlements, the shanty towns and the Hoovervilles of the Great Depression, also overlap with future urban renewal and, as I mentioned, this Red Hook housing development. You can see on the left that's redlining impacted divisions in Red Hook. The 1938 map shows some of those historic housing overlays. On the right, you can see in yellow where the Hoovervilles were, in red where the housing project eventually got developed, and in green where the shanty towns were. So the Red Hook houses really becomes a kind of central theme of the history of Red Hook. It was, as I mentioned, this early housing project. And there was additionally other public recreation infrastructure developed by Robert Moses that was part of that infilled area that was colored on the map that I just showed you. And it's really at the center of a history that speaks to how the neighborhood became so racially divided. 73% of the population, as I mentioned earlier, is concentrated in the Red Hook houses. You can see there are critical changes in demography over time. Within the Red Hook houses, you see a stark, nearly all white population shift to a nearly all people of color population now, whereas race in other census tracts of the neighborhood takes a very different pattern on the right. Those differences, those racial differences, are reflected as well in income, median household income, where those populating the houses much lower, whereas others have seen significant increase in median household income. And these again are comporting with an evolution of narratives related to Red Hook that have evolved over time. As you can see from this newspaper article in the 1930s, that area that was a long-standing area of informal housing since the 1800s, is viewed as a wasteland, sort of land prime for development by the government to provide housing, even though it had been providing housing, that land had been providing housing for decades. Media perceptions specifically of the Red Hook houses also reinforced certain narratives about poverty and about race. And in particular, a significant piece in the 1980s in Life magazine on the crack epidemic identified Red Hook, and specifically the Red Hook houses, as the epicenter of the crack epidemic in New York City, unfairly characterizing this neighborhood in ways that had repercussions over time. And the community still is trying to confront the way in which these media perceptions branded the people and the place of Red Hook. But in many ways, these histories of injustice also speak to a certain kind of social resilience. And what students were also able to discover was a long legacy of activism against all forms of injustice, everything from anti-racketeering, again, because this was largely a port industry community. Of course, there's the colloquialism of the mob controls the waterfront. And so anti-racketeering protests were prevalent. There were also grassroots efforts historically to address environmental injustice. That was associated with a lot of this industry in the area. In response to the branding of the community as the epicenter of the crack epidemic in New York City, in part, at least in response to that, Red Hook Community Justice Center and the Court of Innovation, a spectacularly successful and progressive institution, was established within the Red Hook community. There's been community mobilization against loss of the historic built environment in Red Hook, as well as, particularly after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, a lot of climate activism, geared toward this ability to, be prepared in the event of the next climate event. And it reminds me often of, this quote, that social resilience is often found in places that have experienced deep challenges. They're all too routine, painful experience of disruptions build a deep cultural memory of resilience. And this is in many ways represented in Red Hook. There's a way in which Sandy is culturally memorialized within the community. You can see here this mural. You can see Sandy was here. In a way that this resistance or this preparation or this ability to recover from these climate challenges is a form of bond within the Red Hook community, despite some of the economic and racial divides that are prevalent in planning processes and essentially, the social economic conditions of the community. But in many ways, what students found and what I derive from the students' work is that there is an opportunity that is underutilized with regard to the use of these kinds of histories. We had great feedback and great participation from people within the Red Hook community that we'd like to continue to explore. But what we're finding when we kind of bring this back to the question of climate is that so much emphasis is placed on how we can better visualize and communicate climate risk as an anticipated future. And understanding the past plays a critical role in establishing evidence for why and how different publics ascribe value to and form attachments to place, and accordingly to what they seek to preserve or adapt or sacrifice. And particularly when working with communities that have suffered from legacies of injustice, like Red Hook, one can argue that there's a need to affirm these histories of inequity in order to build trust in climate-oriented planning processes and visioning. And this kind of community-engaged historical work can help bring forth evidence of the patterns of loss and repeated trauma that in many cases have spanned generations. And more importantly, it can undergird the work of resilience and adaptation planning as a tool for restorative justice. And so by fully recognizing these legacies of injustice and using that as a platform for engaging communities, we can endeavor to give space and voice to past exclusion so that history is not repeated, and afford a reparative dimension to climate planning, visioning, and future making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for sharing that work. Next, we have Christina Hanna, Assistant Professor in Environmental Planning at the University of Waikato.
Liz, I'll just share my screen here. Can we all see that?
Looks great to me.
Wonderful. Tēnā koutou katoa, greetings to all. As Liz has already introduced me, lovely to meet you all here, and it's been great to hear from both Kirsten and Erica so far. My colleagues, Professor Ian White and Professor Bruce Glavivic, and I have been researching managed retreats for a number of years now. And here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're actually preparing for the development of new legislation to enable this approach. Our latest article Manage Retreats by Whom and How presents a governance framework to guide these really difficult policy decisions. And we acknowledge the multiplicity of retreats, hence the title, Manage Retreats. Using the framework, we identify and delineate retreat modalities and clarify terminology, converging this with the international mobility literature to harness the lessons from decades of human mobility practice. Today, or tonight for many of you, I'll be giving a brief overview of this research. So, first of all, framing retreat in the singular fails to recognise the nuance of specific contexts and approaches. In reality, there are so many dimensions of retreats which align to diverse institutional realities and social, cultural, and economic values. Our framework here on this slide maps 3 different types of retreats onto a governance continuum, from state control across to societal autonomy. This highlights how the types of retreat are associated with different actors, instruments, and power in order to shed light on who might enable different options, with what tools, and who wields the power to implement retreat decisions. These are important considerations for developing retreat legislation and policy, and ultimately in deciding who manages retreats and how. For example, under hierarchy, we have managed retreats, where the state, using its exclusive authority and legitimacy, enables retreats via legislation, policy, regulations, and standards. For example, we might see the government place property notifications of certain levels of risk on specific buildings. We may see regulations and standards for existing, new, and redevelopment, such as avoiding new development or subdivision in floodplains. Or we might see property acquisition or eminent domain in the US, where the government works to acquire land with limited choice for landowners. Moving across the spectrum, we see more networked governance, or what we termed cooperative managed retreats, where instead of the state being a single authority, we have the civil society, state, and the private sector working together with high social capital, knowledge, and sharing of power via negotiated agreements, strategies, and incentives at the local level. So the types of instruments we may see under cooperative managed retreats are more of your opt-in buyout and leaseback schemes, relocation subsidies, those pull factors to incentivize people to relocate, land swaps, and even transferable development rights. On the far right of the spectrum, we have the governance mode of self-governance or unmanaged retreats, where retreat generally occurs in an ad hoc way and often in a reactive way through high autonomy and diffusion of power. So voluntary price cost contracts and reporting result in retreats due to responses to market signals such as insurance retreat, incentives and disincentives, as well as disasters and increasing risk over time. Current practice in nations such as Aotearoa, New Zealand, tend to sit on the far ends of the spectrum. But when reviewing the broader mobility literature and principles, there is justification for more cooperative action rather than top-down or unmanaged retreats. So how do these modes of retreat compare to the broader mobility literature? Under hierarchy, governments essentially enforce managed retreats to de-risk legacy land use patterns. As you can see here on this slide, managed retreats are similar to involuntary development and resettlement practices which determine why, where, when, and how people mobilise. While authorities may not always determine where people move to, and therefore could be considered involuntary internal displacement, there remains a level of influence on mobility due to planning controls affecting land availability and services. Moving across the spectrum to the centre, we see planned relocations, which ideally deliver network strategic partnerships, which enable relocation and resettlement of affected people and communities on their terms. This planned relocation aligns with our notion of cooperative managed retreats. And finally, at the far right of the spectrum are the ad hoc self-governed movements most commonly referred to as displacement and migration, and these also align with unmanaged retreats, although they can happen from the national to international scales. So what are the key lessons here? Experience and knowledge transfer can advance retreat theory and practice by learning from the devastations of involuntary resettlement and displacement. Forced displacements and resettlements have been disastrous for many communities due to insufficient compensation, ill preparation of host communities, significant health, cultural and social costs, and lack of consideration of the influences of politics and power, which can undermine equitable decision-making. The ad hoc, non-strategic, and sometimes coercive approaches to managed retreats also risk generating the same harms. The mobility literature and practice are now clear that conditions for cooperative action are necessary. For determining how frameworks should be designed, there is now widespread recognition that planned relocation should be undertaken and on the basis of free and informed consent, empowerment, participation, and partnership with those directly affected. For example, see Nansen Principle X. Human rights protections are expected to form the basis of mobility governance, and Robin Bronin and others highlight that the right to self-determination is a key principle for retreats. Rights to self-determine require that people and communities have the authority to decide whether to mobilise or not, when, where, and how. We recognise, however, that there may be circumstances where, due to overriding public interest or environmental harm, state-led managed retreats can be justified. However, in determining retreat modalities to deliver national frameworks, the broader mobility literature and human rights principles direct us towards enabling cooperative managed retreats, or in other words, planned relocations. We recognise, however, that whilst cooperative retreats are likely to be most equitable for retreat of existing activities, hybrid governance pathways are important, such as regulation to inform markets and avoid escalation of risk. Fundamentally, there is much value in integrated retreats, demonstrating a strategically planned approach. This final figure here provides an example of a conceptual strategic policy framework with various governance modes and instruments being operationalized within an integrated strategy. While here we've depicted governance modes and instruments as distinctive in theory, in practice, managed retreats will involve a hybrid of actors and instruments and power sharing across the governance spectrum. There will be a blurring of boundaries. So here on this slide, we show that cooperative strategies and instruments manage existing activities and assets, managing that retreat. There is potential for dynamic application of instruments in any of these modes, such as using a sliding scale over time from buyout to subsidy where locally appropriate. At the same time, however, regulatory instruments are applied to avoid development and investment in risky localities, supported by self-governed but government-devised incentives, influencing behaviour over time in a strategic manner, such as enhancing the pull factors to enable people to move towards opportunity and away from harm. Greater detail of the diverse policy components is required, such as the community-developed retreat triggers, timeframes for alternative land provision, infrastructure withdrawal, realignment, land rehabilitation, and legal protections. For determining when to retreat, the nature of cooperative strategies could be supported by what Bronin and others call community-based integrated socio-ecological assessments. These depend on a community's capacity to assess and document environmental changes and vulnerabilities in collaboration with experts. Particularly for climate change risks, co-production can be integrated into conventional risk management, whereby those directly affected actively engage in risk assessment, capturing the unique nature of a community's vulnerability. Therefore, people and communities can share power by considering and collaboratively setting the social and ecological indicators to assess vulnerability by and the triggers for change, especially for retreat. As recognised by scholars, successful outcomes are expected to be more likely if and when affected people are able to make the key mobility decisions. To protect human rights, managed retreats should not reduce human security, be that physical, economic, health, environmental, or cultural. And therefore, people and communities must be embedded in their design, decision-making, and delivery. The potential social, cultural, and economic impacts of moving people and communities suggest the need for more cooperative governance to enable self-determination with regard to when, where, how, and why retreats occur. For Indigenous and close-knit communities, individualistic strategies may fail to meet their needs, and flexible and inclusive mechanisms will be required. Fundamental policy design questions must include: who are retreats developed for? Who will benefit? And where do the social, cultural, economic, and environmental costs lie? Our research encourages fit-for-purpose local responses to avoid and reduce risks in ways that seek to share power, promote justice and equity, and emphasises the importance of a strategic approach above all. Recognising the plurality of retreats and the lessons from the modalities literature are critical steps to achieving this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Next up, we have John Handmer, who is Senior Science Advisor at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and Emeritus Professor at RMIT University. Take it away, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz and everybody. Let me see, I'll just share the screen. Is that working as a shared screen? Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's not in full presentation mode, but we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Joanna Nalau at Griffiths. Unfortunately, she can't be here. She has lots of other things early in the morning she has to attend to. And also want to acknowledge that this is a history session of sorts, and I assume partly I was put in this session because of the timing, for which we're very grateful. But apologies to those who expected a more historically focused presentation. However, we've tried to rejig things a little bit. I think it's pretty well established that there's a fairly significant wildfire issue around the world. I'm focused here on Australia, but this work is part of a larger ongoing project looking at transformation or transformative approaches to managing wildfire risk and drawing on cases in Southern Africa, Chile, and America, Europe, and so on. So I'm just focused on Australia, but I don't want to give the impression it's the only case. 18 months ago, we did have here a very challenging summer. And just to illustrate here the extent of the fires, the outline map behind is the United States to give a sense of the scale. One thing this doesn't show, which in some ways is even more important, these fires lasted for months, and every fire generated a lot of smoke. And the major cities in the southeast of the country that's the lower right, experienced rather the world's worst urban pollution at times. This is a very challenging position to be in, and it made outdoor activities and even a lot of indoor ones, because of air conditioning systems and so on, impossible without very serious health issues. Possibly 10 times as many people, or more than 10 times as many people, died from the smoke as from the fires themselves. And the fires went, as I said, for maybe 4 months. So starting from this point that we've got a problem with fires, and certainly in Australia, California, and other places, this is acknowledged as a very serious issue and with new dimensions. Now, we could also approach this more from a social perspective, but here we're focused on, I guess, climate change driven change, which ultimately, of course, comes from us. But And so we love having reviews in Australia. The United States, California is a lot more selective about them. Our recent reviews following the fires of 18 months ago all started off by saying that this is a whole new situation that we're in. And they varied, a lot of them. We have a political issue with climate change, but the main driving factors in this are the shifts in heat and dryness, which are quite extraordinary across the Australian continent. There were also systemic impacts with the fires and smoke cascading right through the communities, economies and environment. And also our summers are very dependent on tourism. That was sort of knocked on the head, especially international tourism and travel, just before COVID. So some people are arguing that maybe it helped us. So given this situation, what are we doing about it? Well, at a very general level, many of us think we're not doing anything really, except what we've always done. With a lot more money, a lot more determination, perhaps tweaking, and we love restructuring. So there's probably there's new structures of government, but we're fighting the fires. We're investing in much more burning of fuel, creating a lot more smoke problems with their consequent health issues. More and more, the public health people are starting to say we might be creating more health problems with the smoke than the risks that they might be from burning fuel, than the risks that they might be reducing. Public education, and of course, emergency evacuations. I mean, there are a lot of other issues too, but we're going to talk more about that here today. So to summarize it, we could say in terms of risk reduction, despite changes in what we do, I think we can characterize it as, well, we're doing more of the same. And that's contested. I just want to acknowledge that some of my colleagues would disagree with that. But I don't see that more data sets or a nationally uniform approach, whatever, will have any impact directly on risk. But that's good. So what about relocation or retreat? Apologies again, we are not very clear on our terminology because I think, as we have seen in previous presentations, it's not. There's a lot of room for discussion and debate around, well, what do we mean by retreat or retreats, as our colleague from Waikato called them. Sorry, this is just to illustrate that we continue to do what we've always done, despite all the rhetoric. That doesn't look very fire safe to me. To focus on this issue of retreats or relocation, this is a beach at obviously, perhaps not obviously, where people have gathered. They're not there to take advantage of the sun. They're evacuating from nearby fires. I guess if you look at the people there, you could see that they probably don't intend to spend much time on the beach. They probably intend to go back to wherever they were holidaying or living. And most people, after about half a day or a day, in some cases longer, were able to go back to homes or their hometowns or cities. This is a holiday area, some hundreds of k's from major cities. The thing is, though, some of these people were unable to go back for weeks or months, and some have still not gone back to their homes. And so we thought, well, at what point does a retreat or a relocation or an emergency evacuation become a full-blown retreat? When is that, and what are the criteria? We're going to talk a little bit about it, but not much. I think it's such an open question, but given that a migrant in Australia and internationally is defined as someone who moves for over a year or more, someone who can't get back to the home for a year, we consider as probably in a retreat, perhaps forced retreat situation. But it's arguable. We just put that there for the sake of argument at the moment. So what's happened in Australia? Retreat from fire hazards, without going into the details of it, and there's a lot of detail, but has been advocated at times. And after the 2009 fires, I want to point out they occurred on one day, unlike the fires of 18 months ago, which spread over 4 months and burnt vigorously for 4 months. There's been some retreat. There was after that fire, but it was politically very sensitive. As I've said, our shock jocks who sort of shock horror news commentators really attacked the whole idea that properties could be bought or people could retreat. And in the end, the government bought 116 properties. These were willing sellers to a willing buyer. So we could argue about it, but essentially people only sold if they wanted to sell, and they got a price they would never have got if they'd put their houses on the market after the fires. But we're looking here, our own interest is on equitable processes, but it's also on, well, what happens to the risk? And we have to say that 116 properties around the edge of a city of millions would have negligible impact. But after the more recent fires, there was very little debate on relocation, even less possibly than the 2009 fires. But there was some de facto retreat. There were much more in the way of compulsory mass evacuations, and for a whole range of reasons, including contamination and all kinds of, and the fact that I think Australian authorities increasingly like to manage the sites where there's been an incident. Some people won't return because of financial constraints and other issues, mental health issues and so on. And a few are unable to return because they are prevented from returning. And as I said, there are people now who are still unable to go back to their livelihoods, their former livelihoods and properties. We feel those people are probably, they've been forced out in effect, and they're in a position where they've been forced into some kind of retreat. And the result is that people are forced out with no compensation. Insurance and so on is another issue, but at the end of a 10-year drought, insurance in rural areas drops away because people have very little in the way of income. There are significant justice issues with this. There's another factor which is perhaps very Australian in a way, is that people are now often forced to leave their properties when fires are approaching, so they can't protect their properties, but then they're not allowed back in. Obviously, it doesn't affect the majority of people, but it does affect some. So what could happen? So we thought about this as a scenario, and then we're putting it here as an alternative history. The Royal Commission Public Inquiry after the 2009 fires, which did result in a lot of deaths and a lot of destruction, recommended a buyback of properties in areas of unacceptably high bushfire risk. Now, that wasn't really fully implemented, but let's imagine that was properly implemented. There's no reason why, at least in our minds, it couldn't be. And so we've found that there was a buyback scheme decades, 50 years ago, which worked from a hazard reduction point of view. We could learn a lot of lessons from that. And in this scenario or alternative history, let's assume that lessons were learnt from that. Criteria were established by co-design in a way perhaps similar to our colleague, what our colleagues have mentioned before today. And of course, the fact is that many of the properties being purchased, the houses had been destroyed. Insurers supported relocation and wanted to support the building of houses, new houses in safe areas, and wouldn't insure these high hazard areas anyway. There was fair prices were paid for the properties, and it proceeded over a fairly long time, giving people time to make decisions on where they wanted to move. Mostly voluntary, some compulsory, because we know from our flood experience with voluntary purchase and relocation, there'll always be people that don't move. And so you end up with a situation where services are continuing to be provided and so on. That's an arguable point, but as I said, we're focused on the risk reduction, and there was compensation to help people relocate. Now this, we believe this is a perfectly plausible alternative history, but it did not happen, because in the end, so few properties were bought, and some of them are now owned by the adjacent landowners, and in time, I would expect them to be developed and to create a risk again. So to summarize, or to think, well, where does this leave us? There's, as I said at the start, there is agreement in Australia and I think in California and Europe that we're in a new normal in terms of wildfire hazard. I don't necessarily like the term, but it's what it's a term that's used. And this is, as I said, driven by climate change. And what it's resulted in is extraordinary challenging circumstances for fire and for fire risk management. The risk is much higher, and yet we are not really doing anything about it except to do more. And in Australia, I think we're at a point, perhaps California might be similar, where there's a guard of people, an old guard we might call them, in our emergency fire and fire management areas, who see the future as one where there'll be continuous burning of fuels and we'll all be choking on smoke, but they see that this is the only way forward. I think we need another approach. Unfortunately, or maybe depends on your perspective, there's not much appetite for retreat at the moment, even though we know that we've got to do something different. Of course, areas are burnt out, and in some cases, areas are burnt out repeatedly over, say, a 20-year period. You might have a number of major fires doing serious damage to an area. So this attitude might change, purely driven by, if nothing else, economics. But despite this resistance, and as I said, the media have been nearly evangelically opposed to retreat in the past, but attitudes, I think, are changing. The summer of 18 months ago was a shock to the nation, but now since then it's been pretty wet and mild, so of course people think that was an aberration. Nevertheless, as I said, we have temporary selective retreat, and it takes two forms. One is mass evacuations. It's a default option in wildfire crisis management, and mostly people are evacuated for very short periods, days, weeks at most. But some are away for very long times. As I said, they have retreated. So it's not binary in that there's a continuum, but as I said, most people will return quickly, and this enables them, in the eyes of the authorities anyway, to continue to use and live in high hazard areas, high wildfire hazard areas, with a degree of safety. So that's one effective, and maybe we need to think about temporary retreat as a sort of strategic approach to managing risk. It does seem to be where we're heading, but there's another approach, which is people are forced away, and there's a serious justice issues in this, away from their homes and livelihoods, often with no compensation. And this is despite mass public donation and support for everyone affected by fires. So they've retreated. That's a small group, but we can see that it could affect a whole rural town, for example, if there's no real government support to rebuild that town. So we think, though, that retreat has got to be part of the future. The Bushfire Royal Commission's recommendation, which we looked at before as an alternative history, used the term unacceptably high risk. We argued at the time that if we were in areas of unacceptably high risk, we shouldn't be there because it's unacceptable, whatever that means. And no, there's been no attempt to define that, not in terms of policy. But we think that it's got to be somehow part of, and a formal part of, our risk management future. And we could start by re-examining the apparent successful retreat that was on the edge of Melbourne decades ago. And I think my colleagues here have looked at the history of coastal retreats, or the failure to retreat in the face of all kinds of ongoing coastal hazards. Because we can certainly, I think we can learn a lot from this wildfire property retreat, because it was successful from a risk point of view, and there is no large-scale opposition. As far as we know, there was very limited opposition to it, but we need to examine that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Our final presentation is from Lisa Kelley. Lisa's Assistant Professor of Geography and Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado, Denver.
So hello, I think I might just need John to stop sharing a screen. Am I correct in that? I'm having trouble sharing with that screen up.
Matthew, are you able to help Lisa out with the screen share?
Yeah, hold on.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, John, if you could unshare.
Yeah, there should be a button at the top of your Zoom interface. Okay, I think I've got it now.
All right, go ahead, Lisa.
All right, let me just, we need to adjust this, but let's just do that quickly. All right, thanks so much for having me, and really nice to be here. I know I'm at in between some people's dinner and some people's breakfast, so I'll try to keep time. This is exciting work to present to such a distinguished group of speakers on this theme, it being a relatively new line of work for me, and one which emerged out of collaborations with students and faculty at the University of Hawaii during my time there. So it's a line of work that continues to evolve and develop under a new grant led by Dr. McKenna Kaufman of UH. And I remain very open to critique and feedback and would be appreciative of it. And I also want to begin by acknowledging my positionality here as a white scholar, thinking through these dynamics of coastal vulnerability and development in Hawaii on what remain unceded lands of Native Hawaiian peoples. I'm acknowledging my debt as well to the lessons and wisdoms contained within historical and ongoing experiences and repertoires of resistance, including through ongoing struggles of sovereignty. So an entry point for my work as part of this team has been the extensive histories of shoreline transformation that both anticipate and necessarily precondition some of the conversations taking place around sea level rise and coastal erosion today. And specifically in Oahu, the site of this study, some 30% of the coast, as shown here through this red line along the coastline, is already armored in some form, generally homes, roads, resorts, beach parks, and even some softer measures like coastal vegetation. And this existing shoreline hardening has already been implicated in the loss of a quarter of 72 miles of Oahu's sandy coast that would have existed as of the early 1900s. And so this is a context in which shoreline hardening and the sustained reproduction of shoreline hardening and coastal development have become highly contentious coastal issues, not least because they're facilitating uneven regimes of access to adaptation, but also reproducing some of the vulnerabilities to sea level rise, including high tidal floods, storm surges, and groundwater salinization. So in this, I apologize for my dog. He seems to have gotten excited right at this moment. But in this context, what our work has tried to do is to explore some of the histories of shoreline hardening, which in Dean Hardy's words, may currently operate below the surface of contemporary apolitical discourses, but which nonetheless remain integral to an understanding of just responses to sea level rise. And our approach to unpacking these histories has been to begin from the wealth of experience, both studies and social resistances within Hawaiian studies and linked land, environment, and sovereignty movements. I'm drawing on these understandings, though they've not always been directly connected to questions of sea level rise, as a way to begin thinking through how coastal transformations and developments have been a part of broader projects of US colonization, imperialism, and occupation, and those which spurred Hawaii's transformation from an independent nation to a domain under US control. And in addition to learning and thinking with this scholarship, we've also been trying to draw on the extensive historical newspaper archives that exist for Hawaii, as well as published oral histories and historical maps, using these as tools to reconstruct some of the place-based trajectories of coastal development that are informing the politics of the present. And so I'll talk today just about some of the initial understandings that are emerging from this work that are structuring our understandings. And I'll first take you to Waikiki, thinking with Waikiki in this talk, not only because it's a world famous beach and tourist destination, but also thinking with it as a highly urbanized and intensified coastline, and one that's considered among the sites most vulnerable to rising seas, both from a perspective of exposures to waters and exposures to potential economic losses. Today, a highly industrialized area, one subject to flooding, but an area that as late as the 1900s was primarily a wetland, managed as such by native Hawaiian land claimants, as well as Chinese and Japanese farmers that had originally been recruited to the island as laborers into the plantation economy. And as of 1910, 1920, these farmers were collectively managing some 500 acres of inland rice, taro fields, and fish ponds. These photos at the bottom are evidencing that while some initial developments had already begun to make Waikiki into a watering hole for a growing number of white Westerners settling on the island, including the seawall established, which created the privatized lawn, and the construction of, apologies for my daughter as well, and the construction of the Moana Hotel in 1901. But as yet, at this time, a few backshore developments. And this changed following the US's illegal occupation and annexation of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1898, when the basis for reconfiguring Waikiki was established through Chapter 83 of the Revised Laws of Hawaii. In this chapter, it authorized the then American-controlled government to seize and improve any lands believed to be in unsanitary or dangerous condition. And Waikiki wetlands were shortly thereafter depicted as exactly this, seen as worthless in this newspaper account, except for propagating ducks, in other cases represented as unoccupied and useless swamplands, as well as occupied by only those expecting the community to furnish them a livelihood. And in turn, these discourses surrounding the marginal, worthless, and unoccupied nature of these lands, akin to what was discussed in terms of the presentations of the wasteland of Red Hook, provided an ideological framework for the racially uneven processes of dispossession that followed, and that beget a much more hardened shoreline by the 1930s. And here, arguments from the president of the Board of Health were also informative, and he here making a case for Honolulu's need to recruit white settlers of private fortune, such as those that had made Los Angeles and other towns of Southern California what they were, to use his words. And so in 1918, justified by this law, the superintendent of public works began acquiring much of this land from smallholders in the area by force of eminent domain. And they eventually channeled these mountain streams into a single canal that outlet west of the intended site of tourist development. And much of the earth dredged from this canal was subsequently used to raise this land and infill it. And there's unfortunately not time in such a short talk to do some of the work of unpacking these histories and their spatially and socially uneven dimensions. But what I think is notable is how these initial pathways of hardening and land water manipulations quickly facilitated and to some extent motivated buildup. So infilling in the 1920s of these wetland areas, for instance, gave rise to what was celebrated by 1928 as a remarkable development boom, motivating as well the extensive backshore land use that now characterizes some of the challenges associated with sea level rise. And though beyond the scope of this talk, what also happened during these times were a series of shifts in land control and zoning permissions themselves were then pivotable to waves of coastal land use intensification in the post-war period. And so in this way, it's one of the initial understandings that's been structuring my thinking are how these historical legacies of shoreline hardening and linked transformations in land, water, and property relations can appear to lock coastal areas into a hardened future by creating the possibilities for further hardening. And yet, as I will talk about in just the last short bit of this talk, one of the things that's also notable from the history of Waikiki is the need to resist these neat teleologies or a sense of continuous coastal intensification, given what have long been the unstable nature of these shoreline manipulations. So I'll give an example of this from the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, which was established in the development boom of the late 1920s. This was a photo from 1905, which showed the extensive shoreline anticipating the resort construction in what was at the time this undeveloped plot of coastal beachfront. In 1926, you can see similarly as the resort was constructed, it took advantage of this extensive beachfront. But not even a year after its opening, the private seawall that had been constructed for visitors and users of the resort had already driven such extensive beach loss that the territorial legislature had begun to appropriate large sums of money for groin construction. And here this is evidenced in this photo. You can see the groin that was established left of what was the Royal Hawaiian Hotel and the earlier 1901 Moana Hotel. And yeah, again, this partial efficacy in building up these sands through this year. Another view of this from the vantage point of the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, and the same view in 1928, indicating how already just a year later, this former seawall had been exposed again following high wind and wave action. And so I provide this as like a short testament to what are these very long-standing understandings of how coastal erosion is produced out of seawalls and groins, and how they beget a need for further shoreline manipulations almost immediately. And indeed, this was the focus of a series of articles led by the city engineer in 1935, who highlighted the pernicious feedback loops involved. As important as the instabilities of novel shorelines from a perspective of erosion, however, were the social resistances that also had to be contained, given the way that these developments displaced Native Hawaiians from cultural practices, lifeways, and ancestral lands. So by 1930s, for instance, and in what I think was an important precursor to contemporary debates for managed retreat, members of the Hawaiian royalty were already arguing against the raft of private seawalls that had gone up in front of resorts and private residences. Apologies again. And as Prince Kuio in one example of this argued, if we wish the beach restored, and we do, the thing to do is not to build groins, but to break down the seawalls and reestablish public access. And much as these concerns surrounding erosion and beach manipulations have escalated over time, so too have these resistances. And these are some of the actions that coalesced into what were strengthening Hawaiian sovereignty land and anti-eviction movements by the 1960s, increasingly contesting these developments and enacting alternative visions. So I'll wrap up here. But to conclude, one of the things that we're thinking through, and that this case and others in this session have reiterated, is the way in which shoreline hardening emerges not as in the absence of coastal policy or as a failure of existing coastal policies in controlling development, these being two more dominant apolitical framings, but as part of an aggressive program of shoreline management that has long been rooted in racially uneven processes of dispossession, development, and the elaboration of a regime of adaptation in place. And equally importantly, I think, is the way in which this regime of adaptation in place has involved continuous state developer and homeowner responses to maintain this shoreline hardening and nourish eroding beaches, despite the diverse forces contesting these. And so I offer this in conclusion less as a fundamentally new point, and again, by way of highlighting this treatment in longstanding literatures on coastal development, land, and sovereignty within Hawaii and within critical Hawaiian histories, but also to underscore the importance of engaging with these histories in addressing the contemporary injustices of sea level rise. And this is true, I'd argue, not only given the legacies of racism and uneven development embedded in current coastal infrastructures, but given the way current waves of coastal development and shoreline hardening are arguably reproducing these circuits of affluence and vulnerability. So I'll conclude there with a sense of the present as an unfamiliar familiar. Familiar in the sense that these concerns are longstanding, unfamiliar in the sense that new discourses, new processes of enclosure, and new regulatory frameworks will have to be unpacked to understand how they're cementing and building on these trajectories. Thanks so much, and apologies again for the multiple interruptions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. For everyone who's still with us and watching, please feel free to put some questions in for Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left, and I think there are some questions coming in now. I just want to, give my initial thanks to the panelists for an incredibly thought-provoking set of conversations, and to use, Kirsten, your term, I think, that are really highlighting these histories of relocation and resistance, histories of development and displacement, and unfulfilled visions, and then future possibilities. We've heard about some of the inherited narratives that are shaping how we think about responding now and think about retreat now. And Christina's work highlights these inherited models and how maybe these have to change or be transformed and reinvented and challenged in light of climate change and the kinds of scale issues and glaring injustices that also, are maybe challenging state legitimacy at a time when public action is really needed. It was great too to have John's contribution, because we don't often think about retreat, as much in relation to hazards beyond sea level rise or flooding. And I think, there's a lot of interesting questions about retreat in different contexts, but also, just kind of points to how, if we're going to tackle underlying drivers that are producing risk and producing vulnerability, we can't just stay, focused on these particular symptoms or hazards themselves, because, as I think we all understand, you can't retreat ultimately from climate change. For some people, nowhere is safe, and places haven't been safe for a long time. And for some people, immense amounts of resources are being poured in to ensure that they remain habitable to the extent possible. And there's just a hugely uneven landscape, and we've seen some of that here. So thank you so much for those contributions. We have a couple of questions coming in. The first is for Kirsten. Thanking you for your great presentation and use of history, and a question about how the story might be different if the cottages at Hampton Beach were part of a historic district.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that I haven't pondered. We have some examples you could draw from for example, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where our sort of historic resources that were at risk, or in places that needed to be redeveloped, were then moved to create a living museum called Strawberry Bank. And there's been some really interesting work going on there with their partners associated with the Keeping History Above Water conference, which I think is really interesting. I think if there were a historic district commission that was focused on protecting those particular cottages, there may have been a very different discussion when it came to the state trying to take over the land and turn it into a park. I think different rules and conversations would have taken place there.
Thanks, Kirsten. We have another question that's to Erica, but I'd invite any of the panelists to weigh in on it as well. And this question is, how can we integrate histories of injustice in climate adaptation planning?
I'm happy to answer that, but can I also weigh in on the previous question? Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
I only because as a preservationist and a planner, and someone who's been working in preservation for a long time, I am alarmed by the use of designation as a tool to prioritize certain kinds of climate-related responses. And I say that because there's a tremendous amount of inequity when it comes to what properties are protected through designation, like an historic district. In New York City, for example, our historic districts, both our locally designated historic districts and our National Register districts, all skew whiter, wealthier, better educated. And so, you know, I think there has to be some critical examination of why the tool of designation or districting is an appropriate climate response. And that's not to say that heritage resources shouldn't be saved, but and I think it is a way of prompting a different kind of conversation about place and attachment to place. But I also worry about it being used as a just sort of go-to tool. And I don't know if, Kirsten, you want to respond to that at all.
I think you made excellent points, Erica. I think here we see, you know, certain conversations, certainly around historic preservation, being used as a tool to achieve alternate goals that aren't expressly, you know, explicit. And I think that I see that happening with climate adaptation conversations too, using the conversation around protecting a neighborhood from sea level rise as a way to keep certain types of development out. And I think we have to be critical of those arguments. So thanks for bringing that up.
And in response to the sort of integrating histories of injustice and climate adaptation planning, I think it's, you know, for me, the critical aspects are really working with communities and being very critical about those kinds of histories, not just looking at architectural history or the kind of surface level social histories. But I mean, I think Lisa's presentation is a fantastic example of the kind of deep geographical and social examination that ties so directly to how places physically develop. And the more we can prepare emerging professionals, I mean, I'm speaking as a professor, the more we can prepare emerging professionals in fields like architecture, preservation, planning to tackle those kinds of histories with communities in collaborative ways, I think the more agency communities will have in ensuring that climate adaptation is reparative and not just reparative in social senses, not just climate senses.
Thank you, Erica. And just the 3 minutes we have left, I'd love to have, you know, maybe Lisa and then Christina and John weigh in on this too. And just thinking in reference to your own work, how to, you know, acknowledge and do some of that reparative work in terms of histories of injustice in retreat planning, in climate adaptation planning, in the contexts in which you work.
Well, I can go first, and with the thanks for the questions in the chat. And I'll start, I guess, from the questions in really abbreviated remarks. One of the first being, is land reform a climate adaptation solution? And I think it's the question of land reform and land back to Native Hawaiian communities doesn't need to be a question of climate adaptation, given that it's unceded sort of annexed lands, but it is posing itself as a very viable approach to more sustainable coastal management through a number of restoration initiatives already being realized. The recreation of fish ponds marked by the construction of porous walls that deflect wave energy and allow some waters in, and through the restoration of wetland agricultural systems. So I think part of it is providing the space in which such programs can continue and move forward. And I'll offer that for now, but I think a lot of the points that I'm thinking with are those mentioned by Dr. Avrami in her presentation, thinking through how procedural justice includes not only greater incorporation of long marginalized voices, but also will involve accounting for and working through some of the historical legacies of these injustices. So sorry, I don't have anything quicker that's a little more coherent, but I want to make time for Christina and John as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. I think that covered it very well. I'm sorry, I was responding to a question on the chat at the same time, but yes, I'd agree. I think it's absolutely addressing the historic injustices, and especially here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Indigenous Māori have a specific role to play in their self-determination of their lands. in terms of how they might retreat and whether retreat is even appropriate in their cultural context. And as a Pākehā, a New Zealand European person, I can't speak on their behalf, but that is an area that as we are developing this legislation, we are recognising that we need significant more research and more partnership on and how to develop retreat that's culturally responsive and equitable, acknowledging the past and creating reparations as well in that.
John, any last words?
Oh, only that, look, thanks a lot. And following up from Christina especially, I think what the greater involvement, much greater involvement of Indigenous knowledge in contemporary Australian fire and land management, and an increasing acceptance of this, an increasing acceptance of this is one way that we can move towards, at least in this narrow field that I'm involved with, we can move towards recognising past injustices and attempting the steps towards repairing that damage. But I wouldn't want to overstate it. But yeah, the other aspect is that many of the people and communities affected are, in one sense, in modern Australia, relatively badly off. But they also have, in the Australian context, they have land and they have a lifestyle that they want. And the government increasingly tries to restrict lifestyles, especially in rural areas where traditionally people have a lot more freedom, if you like, of choice. And I think it's hard to see the advantages of this increasing regulation of every detail of our lives. So that's another dimension where there's increasing pushback.
Okay, thank you to all the panelists. Just huge appreciation for your work and for joining across many different time zones. And I really hope we all can cross paths for the rest of the conference. And thanks to everyone for tuning in this evening or morning or wherever you are. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, for moderating. Thanks all.